Our first presenter will be Henry Voigt, a member of the board of directors and our treasurer. Henry enjoyed a long and successful corporate career in international business with DuPont, retiring as CEO of a film division. Over the years, he's built a fantastic collection of culinary ephemera, most especially menus, which, he finds, tell many an interesting tale, including glimpses into the influences of immigrant cultures on American food customs. Please welcome Henry Voigt. Well, we have one more technical problem. They told me to do A and B, but the symbols don't appear, so I can't do it.
I think that's the image they used on the postage stamp. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is, and I can tell a tale about that. That's
it's not
actually
the Statue of Liberty.
that's the one in Las Vegas.
That's the one in Las Vegas. Very embarrassing for the Postal Service. Good morning. When we talk about how immigration shaped American cuisine, I think the first question we really need to address is there such a thing as American cuisine? I think all of us feel like there is, at least I think most of us would feel that way, probably not all. But if you had to define it, you'd find yourself in a real quandary in terms of putting words to what is American cuisine. Paul Friedman, history professor at Yale, wrote 10 Restaurants That Changed America, has a book coming out this fall called American Cuisine, How Did It Get This Way? And he describes American cuisine in 3 different ways. One is around regional traditions, and one is industrialized food products, or what we call processed foods, and thirdly, around variety and choice. So we're gonna focus on variety of choice, because this is expressed in the semi-public spaces of foreign restaurants, and this is where this aspect of American cuisine has come together. Variety and choice is related to other parts of American cuisine. It's a reaction to the industrialized bland products that are produced. One of the ways of getting around that, around the low quality, is to give you lots of variety. I mean, it's much easier to give you 24 varieties of something than one good variety of it. So we're going to talk variety and choice, and we'll start, just touch in the 1840s and then move into the 20th century. The story today is a story of the 20th century. But the immigrants came in waves, as you know, in the 19th century, and we'll just set the base. It's a shame to call this English food, because it's just, but this is an early menu from the 1840s, and the 1840s are when people started to eat outside the home. So this is why we're starting. And it's also when several of the most important or earliest large migrations occurred in the 19th century. And we're talking about menus today because menus are the only documents that tell us how people have eaten out over time. So we don't really have any other record of what people were eating outside the home. So menus are the documents and the only documents we really have. So we'll call this English food. It's just a simple list of meats, very simply described. This is from an alumni reunion at Williams, I believe in 1843. So it's a very early menu. And this is a menu from 1841. The other cuisine that was a base for us was French cuisine for the upper classes. So this is very typical. You have the boiled roasts, cold meats, all these things are described in English terms, English language, and then you have, in this italicized type, all the entrees are in French. And this is the Astor House, which was one of the best hotels in 1841 in the country. And the kitchen mirrored the menu. So in the kitchen, there were English chefs roasting the meats, and there were French chefs cooking the entrees. And just a couple of years after this, they hired an Italian chef to do the pastries. So this is, we'll start in the, as you know, in the 1840s and in the 50s, there were large migrations of Germans and Irish. Almost equal numbers of people came over during that period of time. They had a dramatically different impact on the cuisine. because of the way in which they came. The Germans came as families, and they brought their food traditions with them. The Irish, which had been starved for some time, had lost their food traditions, and they came over as teenagers and young adults in ones and twos, and so they brought no food ways with them, and so they had lost their food ways. So the Germans had a disproportionate impact. This is an early menu from 1866, and this is the place where Walt Whitman went while he was writing the early editions of Leaves of Grass. He went there every night for 4 years, and there were all kinds of artists and writers there. Women were in this beer hall, very unusual for 1866. And because of all what they called the Lions of Bohemia were there, people would write to the editor and say, who's in this place? And they said, there are people called Germans. This is before Germany. There were people called Germans. German restaurants, and we'll cover those first, really were successful. This is Luchow's, which is one of the iconic places, was opened in 1882 and stayed in business for 100 years. It's on 14th Street. This is from about 1905. And there were other large German restaurants in New York. This is the Hofbrauhaus, and then here's one from a place called Hofbrau Garden, and they call it Gourmet's Delight, I believe, Paradise. This is from 1939. It's from Sunset Boulevard. So these were all over the place. But over time, because the First World War, they became less popular, and then the Second World War, they became less popular, maybe less popular because now the tastes were changing. But the German impact on American cuisine was very large because a lot of the foods that we adopted, such as hot dogs and hamburgers and potato salad, we think of as American. We don't think of them as German. And so this was actually, while the restaurants have gone out of favor, their food is very much with us, some of the underpinnings of American cuisine. But as I mentioned earlier, the story starts in the 20th century. It really, in the 1890s, but by 1900, this thing is well underway. Foreign-born restaurateurs who had been serving their own communities, Chinese and their communities, Italians, their communities. It's like the airlines. It's a volume business, and you want to put more people in seats. And so in order to do that in the United States, you have to attract the great middle class. And in order to do that, they changed their cuisine to fit the American palate, what I call here the dominant American palate. And just to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about, there are certain kinds of sweet and sour and spicy combinations that appeal to the American palate. There's much more meat used in the dishes for what Americans prefer. And in case of the Chinese, they narrowed the textures to a very narrow band. Americans want a uniformity in their texture and a blandness in their texture. And so a lot of that was taken out of Chinese cuisine. And what they created was American Chinese cuisine. So the Chinese, if you want pick a starting point, this is a banquet at the Lick House in San Francisco in 1868. Anson Burlingame, who was the ambassador to China. He was coming to Washington with a couple of junior ministers of the Manchu court, and they were going to negotiate the treaty that would allow Chinese immigration. And as we all know, this was in 1868. They were very warmly received in San Francisco. It took 3 weeks for this banquet, the news of this banquet, to get to New York, but it was published in the Times 3 weeks later about it. So everybody was very anxious to get Chinese laborers into the country because they wanted to finish the transcontinental. They had to work the mines. And so there was wild enthusiasm over this. And then, of course, as we all know, in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then we just shut the door. So, but this is the beginning. And they brought their foods with them, and like the Italian workers, the Chinese workers ate their own foods. They brought their own chefs, and when they worked on the railroad, They brought their own food and chefs with them on the line. They didn't eat American food, and they opened restaurants to serve their communities primarily. This is a menu from Boston in about 1902. He says this is the first man to create chop suey in Boston in 1879. That sentence doesn't have any meaning, but it's the kind of hype that the Chinese restaurateurs were so good at. And this is, again, an early menu, and you can see the pattern. And this is a pattern that will expand and grow over time. So you have two kinds of food. You have primarily Chinese American food. So this is chop suey and chow mein, and then you see a few or English dishes here. You see olives, and well, that's what Delmonico's and Sherry's, and all these people would serve olives because this is a way to pad the bill. So the Chinese picked up on that. It has nothing to do with Chinese food. And there's chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla cake. Again, this has nothing to do with China. So it's a combination of American dishes, American food, and Chinese American food, which is American food, not Chinese food. So this is the formula, and this formula expands over time. People would venture into Chinatown, and then before the Chinese restaurants migrated uptown, and they used the word slumming when they went there. And this is a magazine illustration, and you can see immediately this is racially biased, imperialistic, romantic. There are a lot of ways you can describe this image. But Chinese restaurants did nothing to help Chinese assimilation. In the food world, they would love to believe that this food brings us together. It doesn't. People can like Chinese food and not like Chinese people. It's very easy to happen in this country. So it didn't help Chinese assimilation, and they struggled. And the reality of these restaurants didn't look like that. They look like this. But people like the food, and they kept coming. Now, here's another example of the racially biased attitudes. This is an Upper East Side group of people who went down to Doyer Street in Chinatown for a party in, I think, 1912. And this is the invitation. And diamonds are disbarred. Don't wear your diamonds. And you can go as Dago, Chink, or a Posh. A Posh was a Parisian street culture thing. So you can see the racial prejudice there. So these are people who like to go to Chinatown, love Chinese food, but don't show a lot of respect for the people. But the Chinese persevered. This is chop suey. I think most people know this painting by Hopper. I show it because you have two women eating chop suey here, and I think this is something you don't read in the books about chop suey, but I believe it's true, and I think that nobody wants to say, well, what do women want to eat? Nobody wants to touch that subject. They have wonderful ways of getting around answering it. But the fact is, if you read the interviews of the Chinese restaurateurs, they said women like chop suey. They'd go after the theater for a late supper. A man would order a steak, and a woman didn't want to eat a steak at 10, 11 o'clock at night, and chop suey was vegetable-based and had less meat. And I think women helped that along. And then this is the Nutmeg Club party at Port Arthur in New York. There's lots of little indications, a little inscription on the bottom from 1917. So there's a lot of indication that women's groups favored this cuisine. This is the last Chinese menu I'll show, but it's from about 1926. And this is now this is from Philadelphia on Walnut Street. It's a 4-page menu. There are 2 pages of what they call Chinese food, which is American Chinese food, and there's 2 pages of what they call American food. So that's the form. It's 50-50. It's all really American food. They have a dance floor. They were broadcasting radio shows from this, so it was a very stylish place. So they really persevered, and they were very successful. The next group that was you could say almost equally successful were the Italians. This is what they called an Italian table d'hôte, meaning host table. It's a type of Italian restaurant which is named for the fact that it has a fixed price meal that it offers for lunch or dinner, in addition to its regular a la carte. But it's really named after its. This particular place is called Reganesci's Saturday Night by John Sloan. And I was very fortunate. I found this in San Francisco. I found a menu from Reganesci's. I think this is the only one that exists. But this is the format. In the front, you've got this. They would write in what the special would be that day, but you can see the pasta dish is printed. That's always served. And then you open up the menu, and this is actually very Italian for the time. It's really an Italian menu, an Italian restaurant. People in New York were complaining in 1916 that there wasn't any real Italian food left, but actually I think there was compared to other places. I'll just show this menu from the New Italy in 1904, and this is maybe a little more typical. Again, you have the lunch and dinner table d'hôte, and you can see where they've written that in. And then when you open the menu, this is really mostly just American food. And again, they broke the code, and we'll get into this a little bit later, that this formula of lots of American dishes and lots of Italian-American dishes. So it's really an American menu. It's not Italian food. And this one more. This is a postcard, and this is a place called the Carlos in New York on 24th, I believe, Street, and they're advertising their table d'hôte for a specific day. And the Carlos. This was actually a place, just by coincidence, where John Sloan and his wife Dolly would often go. This is also has a constant pasta dish. In their case, they called it pasta alla Carlos. I don't know what it was, but and French food, which is always really the food of the upper classes, what they call the hegemony of French cuisine. It just dominated. What is great cuisine? It's really French food, and that was the case for so long, and to some extent it still is. But there was French food migrating into the middle classes, but I think almost the upper middle classes. This is a place on University Place in New York at East 9th Street called the Lafayette. Their table d'hôte is $1.25, and that's twice the price of the Italian table d'hôte. I don't know if you noticed, but it was 65 cents. So it's menus are always a reflection of class, and this is a little higher class clientele or patronage. And there were other good groups. This is Antoine's from about 1912, and this is French Creole cuisine. French Creole is really related to New Orleans. It's a combination of French, Spanish, Haitian, West African, German, and I've left out a couple of cuisines. It's different than Cajun cuisine, but has a lot of similarities. So there was the French influence there, and then San Francisco always had since the gold rush, San Jose and San Francisco, the French chefs that went to the mining camps migrated further west and set up shop in San Francisco. This is a group of restaurateurs who had various restaurants over the years, and then after the earthquake and fire, they combined forces and recreated the old Poodle Dog in San Francisco. So this is at a family gathering of French restaurateurs. And the old Poodle Dog, again, was not an upper class place. It catered to middle class people. If you look at the reservation book, you can see high school teachers groups going there for dinners and things like that. So it was very much at the heart of social society in San Francisco. And this is the inside of the menu, and they have a fixed price menu. This is, I think, what, New Year's Eve or Christmas. And so they have, it's $2.50. It's a little more expensive because it's a holiday. And then they have a la carte on the right with things as mundane as cheese sandwiches and other things. So everybody can find something to eat. There was also, in addition to modifying their cuisines, there was also a new ideal, I call a new ideal at the turn of the century, and that was that only in the United States could you find the foods from so many nations. There was a real pride in the aughts about this, that, and sometimes you could find them even on the same menu. And this is a menu from, I believe, 1906, the Cafe Martine, which was on Madison Square in New York. The Martine brothers were from the Savoy in France. They had actually run the Lafayette that we saw earlier before they took over Delmonico's old location on 26th Street and Fifth Avenue, and they opened the Cafe Martine. It was one of these very stylish places at the turn of the century. They described themselves as the best French restaurant in the country, which is pure hyperbole. But if you look at the front of this menu, it's read the menu. There's French dishes, but there's also German dishes and English dishes. And on the back, they have a whole series of cuisines that they're serving, and they're treating French cuisine as just one of the cuisines. On different days of the week, they have different daily specials. This is kind of the Rosetta Stone of menus. This is really a treasure. Then there's Russian and Polish dishes. Around 1906, in that early aughts, there was a lot of Russian and Polish immigration, and they're reflecting those dishes. And then what they call Oriental cuisine, which is Austrian, Hungarian, Greek, and Turkish. And you'll see that terminology used right into the 30s, actually, for those cuisines. And then Spanish cuisine. So they're all on the same menu. And this menu really expresses an ideal at that time. Prohibition and the Great Depression was fertile ground to bring in more cuisines, because for several reasons. Prohibition, the fine restaurants in the country closed, and the foreign foods were good, and they were good relative to the other cuisines, the other American restaurants, which were declining in quality rather rapidly. Prohibition, the speakeasies didn't care about the quality of the cuisine, so there was a rapid decline in the quality of cuisine in the United States. And after Prohibition was repealed in 1933, it took 50 years before we even began to climb out of that bottom. So we bottomed it, and we stayed at the bottom for 50 years. And people tried to do things. Duncan Hines did it his way. Other people tried to raise the bar, and it was gone. We lost it. So legislation like that has quite a long tail of consequences. The other thing about this is that the Great Depression, when people would come to the United States, the restaurant business is low barriers of entry. You bring your cuisines with you. You can get into the business. Everybody in the family can work in the business. So the Great Depression was fertile ground for everybody to take a shot at this. So here's one. There was a neighborhood in New York that's kind of forgotten, but it was called Little Syria, and it was down on Washington Street in Lower Manhattan. And this is a Syrian, I'll call it the Middle Eastern. They called it Syrian, but the Middle Eastern with Arabic and English writing. And they actually moved uptown. There was one place called the Sheik. This was the Baghdad, and they would have two menus, and one in Arabic and one in English, and this is from 1937. So that was a place to get good food for not a lot of money, and they migrated up as far as 28th Street and around in the middle of Manhattan. both sides of Fifth Avenue. Armenian restaurants were popular. Here's an early one from 1931, and they're explaining their cuisine on the back of the menu. This doesn't work. This doesn't work. You have to change your cuisine. But Armenian restaurants stayed around through the 40s. Russian cuisine. Only Japanese restaurant in New York for American people. Isn't that fascinating? I would love to have learned more about this menu, but it was all in kanji. This is the ultimate irony. For all the influence, there is very little paper left from the early Greek restaurants. This is from Chicago, I believe from about 1934. You can see that they still describe it as Oriental cuisine. It's in Greek and in English. And they were wildly successful, but the paper trail is very, very hard to find. This is a place in Greenwich Village, Spanish restaurant. I only put that up so you can see that Mexican food was called Spanish Mexican food. And this is from the 30s. And the cuisine looks like this. There's no tacos, there's no guacamole, but there are tamales, something called Mexican chili, dishes like that. There was guacamole now. The avocados were called alligator pears around the turn of the century. That's when they first started to come in from Central America, South America. Then became avocados later. At the same date of this menu, I found guacamole on a menu from the Hilton in Long Beach. They had a restaurant at the top of the Hilton at Long Beach in the 1930s, and that's where one of the movie star haunts. This is a Mexican restaurant. Other than California, there was also Texas, and they come from the turn of the century. This restaurant was in existence, and I have one menu from 1906. This is in the 30s. But you can see the proprietor is a fellow named Farnsworth, and in food history we call that cultural appropriation now. So it's just not, this would be really frowned on today. Indian restaurants are very unusual. They say this is from 1939. They're talking about, or 40, they're having Hindu music. There were almost no Indian restaurants at this time. The Hindu traditions did not lend themselves to restaurants, and so there really were none. But this is an Indian restaurant from 1940 in New York. But the special is roast chicken, and that gives you a little hint, because that was one of the Chinese restaurateurs' secret weapons. They apparently really knew how to roast a chicken, and the Indians were taking after that. Indian restaurants really began with the partition of the Punjab in 1948. It created a number of refugees, and they really needed to make a living, and that's when Indian restaurants got started. And so what we think of as Indian food is primarily Punjabi cuisine. And this is something that really has affected, called the Veto Vote in the restaurant business. The Veto Vote is a group of 4 or 8 people, family, work group. One person just doesn't want to do it, and you don't go to that restaurant. And this really has affected Indian restaurants because they haven't adapted their cuisine to the American palate. You can see appropriately named Punjab. This is from 1955. And they've tried foods from the Far East, and you see 1 or 2 curries, but then there's foods from France, foods from sunny Italy, and American foods. So they gave it a college try, but that didn't, they really struggled. And then Indonesian cuisine, 1946. This is a rice stoffel. It's in a place called the Holland House, appropriately named. Again, cultural appropriation. But if you go to 1959, a bit of Bali in New York, this was a whole different thing because the cuisine was Indonesian, Chinese, Indonesian, Indian, and Indonesian. So it's a real authentic cuisine. Craig Clybourne reviewed that restaurant in 1959, and this is the first time that the word ethnic was used relative to food. So this is when ethnic came into the vocabulary, and it had to do with authenticity. Celia Chang, with the Mandarin in San Francisco, was a proponent of that. Her restaurant, and she's still alive, 97 years old. Her restaurant, the Mandarin, is in one of the 10 restaurants that changed America. Another, then fusion. Fusion is an expression of globalization, but the people who create the fusion are actually immigrant chefs in this country who have an audience for the variety and choice. So the Susanna Fu actually comes from Foshan, which is a neighborhood of outside of Guangzhou, and this is French Chinese cuisine. And it's still going on today. This is a Cambodian sandwich shop near where we stay in New York. Cambodians don't have sandwiches, but this is still going on. Still going on, Cambodians. So, you know, the ephemera is out there for the taking. So just to wrap it up, where do we stand today? There are 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the country. So I think there's more than McDonald's. I don't know. It's a big number. 28,000 Italian restaurants, not counting pizzerias. As I mentioned earlier, the Germans' dishes were absorbed into the mainstream. Other foreign restaurants are still serving immigrant communities and inspiring new cuisines. And Indian food is certainly not dead in this country. It serves immigrant communities. It serves very, I call sophisticated urbanites. And it also is the inspiration for the new vegetarian cuisines. You go to some of the best vegetarian restaurants in the country, and they're taking a page out of Indian cuisine. So they're around, and the ways in which to adapt their cuisine for what Americans want to eat is being worked out, but it's not being worked out in Indian restaurants. It's being worked out in vegetarian restaurants. And then the ironic point I went into within the end, these restaurant traditions, these so-called foreign foods, are American foods, and they're American food traditions. And they're kept alive today by immigrants. But they're not kept alive by the immigrants you might think. The Italian restaurant you're in could be owned by Croatians. The Japanese restaurant might be run by Chinese. Almost certainly the Thai restaurant that you're in is run by Vietnamese, and so forth. So they are keeping our faux foreign cuisines alive and well. So with that, I'll have questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering if you thought much about kind of the Latinization of all of these cuisines, because most certainly people working in the kitchens are Latino of some sort across the nation.
Yes.
And so, you know, how much of that kind of cultural fusion is happening?
A lot, and it's just later in time. So I really cut this off in the 90s after the word ethnic comes in. I kind of wrap it up a little bit, but the Latino influences are great. There are a number of cuisines in South Florida. Floribian is one of them. Nouveau Latino, and these are really great restaurants. These are really great restaurants. And of course, you have the Cuban restaurants in Miami, which is serving the Cuban community in Miami, but also attracting a lot of people from all parts of society.
Trust me, they're everywhere in Florida.
Huh?
Cuban is everywhere in Florida.
Yeah, it's everywhere in Florida, but it's also there's lots of influence there, and very inventive cuisines, because they're actually combining their own cuisines, again for the American palate. In this country, we'll say, you know, I don't want Chinese. I had Chinese yesterday. Let's go for Thai or something like that. It's very unusual. This was only in the United States until very recently. Now this is part of American culture that's going to other parts of the world. This kind of nomadic taste. Yes.
You mentioned the cultural appropriation was being frowned upon
Robert,
in some certain
hang on a
terms.
second.
But also then concluded with this reference to a lot of foreign restaurants being run by culturally inappropriate people, and then we have the Latinos in the kitchen. Does that not sort of run against the grain of the question of immigration and assimilation, so to speak?
Well, it's the cultural appropriation is a big deal in the food community, and if somebody writes a cookbook about some foreign cuisine, and they just have no relationship to that culture, there's a feeling that the people are being ripped off. Somehow that is not translated to Croatians owning an Italian restaurant. Nobody's making that connection. And actually, the Italian restaurant is not even Italian. It's, as I said, Italian American. Yeah, yes.
We have to get,
Okay.
we have to get the microphone, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And it's very true. I just went to Sushi Soba down the street yesterday, and it's actually run by Chinese, Japanese restaurant. They don't even try to hide the fact, actually. They were talking in Chinese, and they were listening to Taiwanese music, pop music. But I'm curious, seeing from a Asian American or Asian angle, it's quite intriguing because in Asian American literature written by male writers, the Statue of Liberty of the previous speaker very often is eroticized, sexualized. In other words, for Asian immigrants or Asian American writers, the object of desire, whiteness, is very often denied to them. And very often they have to do it through the back door of a white woman. So you're barred by white masculinity, that is the center of the United States, so you go through it through the back door. And in Asian American literature by male writers, I said, very often Statue of Liberty becomes a trope for whiteness, for Americanness. So that's one aspect of it. And I was curious about the recent development, for instance, in big cities like New York. New York Times has reported on this as well. There seems to be a sort of a trend right now for a lot of new restaurants opening up in New York, where I didn't even frequent these places, but just from the store signs, from their names, you can see they're no longer doing all these things. Very often they would be using Chinese scripts, 一碗面, for instance. I saw it yesterday in New York Chinatown. And actually it was spelled out on the menu in Pinyin. It didn't even try to explain it. 一碗面 means a bowl of noodle. In other words, I think you see several things in this kind of phenomenon. This is all over, not just in one store. They're using words that are either Chinese or spelled out in Pinyin and didn't really try to accommodate English speakers. In other words, it's almost like catering to the rise of China and the Chinese-speaking clientele. And I suppose there is another aspect involved in it. Perhaps New Yorkers are more curious and they see more authenticity when they see a store sign that they couldn't even pronounce.
Yeah, well, there's several factors going on there. First of all, they are serving the Asian community, number one. Number two, you have hipster culture, and that they don't want it to be in English. And then the ideal today is globalization, and this is an expression of globalization and authenticity, as you mentioned. So it's a number of different factors. And of course, all those places that are opening, there's another place that's closing. It's a mass balance. So one has to go out for one to come in. So when you see lots of new restaurants, that means lots of restaurants were not successful. Yes.
You mentioned Luchow's closing after 100 years, and I'm just curious, of the immigrant restaurants, are there any others noted for their longevity? Because we're talking about restaurants opening in
there are. I'm the same. Oh yes, Linda was asking whether or not Luch House was open for 100 years, and she was wondering if there are restaurants around today which have been open for a long time, and what I would call iconic restaurants like Luch House. Musso and Frank's in L.A. is an example of that. It's been around for a long time, and it still exists as a kind of a center for Hollywood.
Traditional one in Boston, I forget the name, but was there for 200 years and just recently closed.
Yeah, that we don't. Yeah, Durban Park that's gone.
You gotta get to the mic.
What I've just found interesting is that you have no English restaurants, considering.
That's because they made everything English food.
Some of us can actually cook. The other thing I really found interesting is that you have the Chinese at the top of restaurants here, but in Britain, it's the Indian restaurants. There's more Indian restaurants now in Britain than any other form. Chinese comes next. I don't know where the English food comes, because most of it's horrible. But I just found that fascinating, that the Chinese...
Well, the partition of India, the UK was one of the places the refugees could go. And one of the things that...
Tell us what inspired you to research this particular area that you have so much passion for.
Food?
Well,
I've always been interested in culture, and in my career with DuPont, I did business all over the world, and it was very interesting relating to people in different cultures and the centrality of food in relationships. And I worked with people from other countries who could not adapt to the local foods, and the peoples in those countries had a lot of trouble understanding that, and would talk to me about it a decade later. Brian never ate with us. They could never figure it out. So it's deep in our way of relating to people. And I could have given a talk today on symbolic foods, foods that just have great symbolism. People eat them because of their symbolic nature. That's just interesting to me. So I'm more interested in the cultural aspects than the culinary aspects. Sometimes I have to write something for a culinary magazine or I talk to a culinary group, and I'm really a little bit on edge because they're passionate and they're knowledgeable, and and so I'm not as expert in that. I don't want to get into.
Okay,
Yes.
tell me where you're going next.
Diane. Oh, Barbara, I can't see you.
I've got curly hair now, too.
A quick question about, you talked about prohibition having a terrible effect on the restaurant business. In Washington now, there's a real concern about unlimited liquor licenses because more and more restaurants are opening, and you won't open a restaurant if you don't get a liquor license. And so do you see that affect other places, or do you see cities trying to limit liquor licenses?
Yeah, that's just a personal view. I just think these blue laws are ridiculous. I mean, you can't ship wine to Delaware. What does that mean? I can't ship wine from New York to Massachusetts because that's not allowed. I mean, so in the liquor license and all that, it just ways for people to get tax revenue and to protect entrenched interests which are left over from prohibition.
I guess I'm going to follow up because what I'm hearing, Rose's, which is in Washington Star Restaurant and Pineapple and Pearls, I've talked to Aaron. The issue is among the restaurateurs. That if you have so many restaurants opening, obviously a lot are closing at the same time, and it's not so much blue laws as business for the city?
Well,
And I don't mean money, but.
well, but it's what I didn't say it. Well, it's entrenched interests. It's entrenched interests. So if you have a liquor license and you have a restaurant, you have something that is in limited supply. If everybody can have a liquor license, you've got a lot more competition. So if you can, in the same way, why can't I take a shipment of wine from California? Well, because the liquor stores in Delaware don't want me to do that. They want me to go to the liquor stores, and they've controlled the political issue. David, did you have?
How do you explain the new popularity of a dish called avocado toast?
Yeah. I don't. There is an answer to that, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. It does taste good. It's. I know maybe vegetarian.
Henry, do you want me to jump in with my question now?
Yes.
Save you from that one?
Yes,
I'm curious, does international cuisine appear on menus for travelers on American railroads, airlines, and maybe even domestic cruise lines? And do you collect those types of menus?
Yes, I do. It depends on the. For the cruise lines in the 19th century, I'm interested in that, to transatlantic and trans-Pacific carriers. A lot of those, that is English food, actually. It's the Cunard line is really what the Americans took. There were American competitors to the Cunard line, but they focused on speed and luxury. And the Cunard line was on parsimony and safety. So guess who was left standing? The others all hit icebergs, and they were gone. I collect airline menus through World War II. It's just interesting to me when that first commercial aviation wave got started. But there's not a lot of cuisine. The cuisine for airlines, for example, I mean, the quality of the cuisine is proportional to the height off the ground. So, you know, a revolving restaurant on top of a bank would be very poor, and an airline would be, you know, much, much worse. And there's no way to make the airline food good. It has to do with the altitude and other things. If they could make airline food good, the research that has gone into that is incredible. But it just is not going to taste good. There's no way to make it taste good up there because of various effects on your body.
One last question.
Anybody?
What's that?
Henry, you were talking about the social importance of food, and I was thinking the social importance of eating that food, manners and handling food and so on, how it's absolutely forbidden to violate some of those rules of decorum.
Yeah, the people in various countries do not expect you to be, or in many cases do not want you to be expert in their culture or in their language. What they're looking for, and there's no way to fool them, they're looking for respect. If you respect their culture, and that big part of that signaling of respecting the culture is the food. So maybe you can't eat with chopsticks. Maybe you can't get it all down, but maybe you try, and you should eat it as much as you can. Some people just simply can't. But yeah, it's a question of respect and signaling respect, and you just can't play the game to be completely knowledgeable. You'll create all kinds of faux pas through dinner without even. But there's a lot of forgiveness for that because you don't know. But But they also, people all over the world, and all cultures, I mean, I'm talking about every place, all through South America and Russia and China and Japan, and I've been eaten everywhere. And it's a question of respect and in your behavior around their food.
Okay, thank you, Henry.